end of the first and during the second year, you start to tell a baby that he or she can wait a moment. You can't do that at 2 months, but you can start to do it after the regulation is secure enough. And the truth is that the more the regulation is secure, the more it can wait, right? In other words, the successes, if you think about it as an addiction, you'll think about it the wrong way. You'll say, well, let's say, my wife is bugging me all the time, and I say to myself, this is lose-lose. If I don't pay attention to her, she's going to be hurt. Not good. If I do pay attention to her, it's a bottomless pit. That fantasy of a bottomless pit is a fantasy. It's not a reality. In other words, once you create the intersubjective regulation and it starts to work, that's where change takes place. That's where people become more able to say, I know that you want to respond. I know that you want to be able to be there for me. And since you've done it, RIG 7, 8, 10, 15, I can wait. I have hope. I have a evoked companion that I can bring up who's there for me. You're not there right now, but you will be. So the issue of time and the issue of being available but stating that you're available and when you'll be available becomes part of the regulation. Regulation is not only instantaneous. The younger we are, the more it's instantaneous. The older we get, the more it needs some element of delay and the possibility of waiting. That's the first issue about the regulation. I put up on the screen a slide that we skipped for the sake of time last week, and that, if you look at it, these are the functions of what's called the core self. Daniel Stern's, if you don't know what else to say, you say something is a core. Say it is a nucleus, use a word, but no one knows what it means, but it's a set of functions that include, you see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, right? In other words, the baby's alertness, it happens in spouses too. People wake up when they listen to each other, right? So if you want a baby to learn to be alert, you do things that make them alert, like playing, like making them curious, like hiding and playing cuckoo, playing hide and seek. In Israel, it's called, in Hebrew, it's called cuckoo. There is no word for hide and seek, it's called cuckoo. But hide and seek, the intensity of affect, people regulate each other. In other words, a mother who's available for the child is interested in the child being not just happy, but really happy. She's interested in a smile, but a huge smile, right? How do you get a huge smile out of a baby? What does it mean out of a baby? That you accompany the baby on its way to the self-experience of a huge smile. You smile at him, and then he smiles more, and then you smile more, and then you build up a smile. If you think about it, a mother who is not available for that, or a father who's not available for that, or, as you raised in the blog, somebody who's busy with the cell phone, isn't going to be having the availability or the pleasure of doing that and creating that huge smile. But don't forget, when the mother gets a huge smile from the baby, it's mutual. It's mutual. You've created something. You're a self-object regulating the baby, and the baby is regulating you too. It has to be mutual. The secure attachment has to do with, cuddling. When a baby is, as we say in the yeshivish, it's kvetchy, right? When a baby is kvetchy, but you want him to be able to become more secure. Yeah.
And just the question that comes up.
You have to talk louder. Okay. For me.
The question that comes up for me is saying that the mother regulates the baby and then the baby regulates the mother in return. Did I understand it well? Because I'm asking because, on the other hand, there are mothers who regulate with the babies all the time. I don't know, I wonder if the baby's not regulating more to the mother and then attuning to the mother instead of the opposite.
Since it can be mutual, it can also be exploited. The whole area of self-object function is an area where the danger, one danger is too little, and the other is too much. What does too much mean? That rather than responding to the baby's need to be happier, the mother is desperately needing it for herself. And though she's exploiting, she's using the baby. And you'll find it's not so common with fathers, you'll see mothers who are so busy being a perfect mother that they forget that there's no such thing as a perfect mother. There's, as you'll learn with Barbara, a good enough mother for a particular baby. It's an intimate relationship. It's not a function by itself, it's a function in a relationship. So you'll find mothers who may be trying to keep the baby always quiet when babies don't need to be always quiet, right? When the baby cries and the mother freaks out inside and has to take care of it without a delay, and the baby's need maybe to say, you know, I'll be there in a minute, and the sky won't fall if you cry for 5 minutes, right? It depends on what's right for the baby. So that's a matter of a mutual adjustment, and we'll get more to that later, but it can be exploited if you don't see the particular baby and what that baby needs now in the regulation. Yeah?
So along the same lines as like a parent who really wants to come to give to the baby, to the children, but really it's his need to give.
So the need to give. But what about parents who need to give to the baby out of their need to give, and rather than the baby's need to be given to? Parenting is about seeing what the baby needs. Couples or families are about seeing what the other person needs. So you're always dealing with two parallel lines. You're dealing with what the other person needs from me now and what I feel like giving, right? So the primary, put it this way, all relationships work if you can see the other person as well. No relationship works if you cancel yourself out. You can't not be there. And the reason you can't not be there is this topic of the next topic. So we're going to move ahead with that. But the baby doesn't want only to be given to. The baby wants the presence of another person. And you can't be only giving and be yourself. So, but that's something we're about to explain.
Can I ask just a question?
Yeah.
About the generalization of the experience of the baby.
Yeah.
How would it be generalized? Is there like a way to predict it, or has to do with personality? How big you'll generalize it?
Right. The representations and the generalizations, and how we know which baby is doing what kind of generalization. That, if you want to do a doctorate, that's a great topic, because we don't know much about that. We know, for example, that there's some variation in what's called temperament in babies, probably mainly the level of activity. The rest doesn't pan out when you research, but it's useful to think about different levels of different kinds of temperament. How does a particular baby make a generalization? It's an awfully important question, and we'll pull it to one particular place, which is useful. You know, these days a lot of attention is being given to something called attention deficit disorder. Now, as a pediatrician, I can tell you no one has a clue what that is, except for an excuse to give a drug called Ritalin. But probably some children pay less attention than others. Let's put it that way. Now, to your question, Livia, if a baby is not paying attention easily, they're going to have trouble doing generalizations, because that generalization requires time inside the brain. The brain doesn't do simple functions. We've stopped thinking about the lightning speed of the nervous system that does things instantly. That's romanticism of the 19th century. The 21st century knows that the brain takes some time to do something conscious. It takes time to do something like a generalization. Now, that was discovered after Stern wrote his book, so it's not in the chapter. But the brain, to do a generalization, it's something called re-entry. In other words, movement in the brain from one center to another, if you want to think simply, from the center that has to do with emotions, to the center that has to do with body sensations, to the center that has to do with thinking. Freud called it ego and superego, but the main thing is not this does that and that does that. The main thing is that I recycle, what's called re-entry, from one place to another a couple of times. You can measure how long it takes for the nervous system to do that, and every mother knows that, you know, because, you know, when you say that, you know, the light goes on, or the asimon, for those who remember what asimon is, the asimon goes down, or, you know, when you chop something, the guys know it from, you know, when it finally, you're looking at it and finally say, oh, why didn't I see that before? Oh, so that oh isn't instant. So the babies who lose track of their reentry before they're doing the generalization are going to do less generalization, and then their experience is going to be less robust. Is that proven? I just gave you a topic for doctorate. You want to do it, somebody else wants to do it. In other words, these are things that are important to ask, and once you ask, then you'll find out that no one else has studied it yet. But every mother looks at the baby as an individual baby. In other words, a mother who says that you're number 4, I already know what to do. Oops, that ain't right, right? You're number 4, I am practiced with seeing the difference between number 1, number 2, and number 3. It will be easier for me to see how number 4 is different from what, and that's what you hear from others, right? And how it's different, that's a good question. One question, and then we're going to go on, because otherwise we won't go on. Yeah, Moshe.
So, I didn't understand exactly.
You have to help me to hear it.
You just mentioned ADD being children that might have, since they're so processing, they'll have a harder time with generalizing.
Right.
So, I guess my experience with ADD people they might suggest, of course I know very little what we really don't understand what generalization is, but a lot of ADD people come up with 4 generalizations at once, which means they seem, a lot of kids that have been taking Ritalin, they seem not to be less slower than their friends, but rather they look at things in 4 different ways, and they have different associations coming at them at once.
Right. That's because
seem to be quicker at generalizing.
right. The question is, some children who are called ADD seem to be fast processing and multiple processing rather than single processing. That's because we don't know anything about ADD. So, you know, as you say, some kids who take Ritalin say that. That's true. There's a whole bunch of different kids. They're all squashed together. It's not very scientific. So that's a good question. You see somebody who says, I'm thinking too fast rather than too slow.
But they've been treated as dumb kids their whole life.
What?
But they've been treated as dumb kids their whole life.
So if those kids are treated as dumb kids, that's the question. So that's a tragedy that needs to be taken care of. There are a lot of brilliant people. Einstein was one of them, who processed differently. And because he processed differently, he flunked. Seder. That's, you know, when you see families and you see some kid who's, you know, not fitting into the mold, you'll always ask Moshe's question. Is he below the mold, beside the mold, above the mold? He's not in the mold, that's for sure. But where is he around in the mold? It's not always under. The more the mold is rigid, the more the assumption is that if you're not in the mold, you're under the mold, right? But we don't hold by that here, right? You're not in the mold, so let's find out where you are. Or to go back to Levia's question, how are you different? And what is it that helps you to move better? So let me go on now. So we talked about the regulation, and I'm going to give you a simple example of a child who's about 7 months old, and the mother is busy, and there's a ball on the floor. So the mother picks up her finger, points at the ball, and says, in the nicest possible way, pay attention to the ball so I can do something else, okay? And the baby looks at the finger, follows it, and the baby's attention goes to the ball. So the attention belongs to the self of the baby. But who regulated it? The mother's hand, right? Okay. Now, let's go, that's what we call the realm of regulation. But let's go one step further. Let's make the baby 2 years old now. And mother has to do something. I'm going to give you an example which some feminists wouldn't like, but it fits into some realities. Don't take it too personally. Her mother-in-law is coming, and she's looking out the window to see when her mother-in-law is going to show up, because she has this, you know, special broccoli quiche that's in the freezer, and women know how many seconds it needs to go from the freezer through the micro and then into the oven, because this is going to be presented as a fresh quiche prepared for you, because for Shalom Bayis, So she's looking out the window because she has to figure out when the car comes in, how many seconds. It's a complicated thing. And she's busy. All good reasons. And the baby wants attention. So she takes her finger and she points to the ball and she says, 2 years this is working. Play with the ball. It's a little dirty, but play with it. And the baby, at 2 years old, climbs up on the counter. Mother's looking out the window. Baby climbs up on the counter and looks out the window. Now, what is the baby looking for? The answer is that the baby is looking for mother's subject. In other words, the baby now is not interested in what mother wants me to do. The baby is interested in who are you? What's got your attention? What is happening inside of you? What are you looking for? So how do you find out if someone's looking, what somebody's looking for? You look out the window with them, and then you can see through their eyes. Now, at that point, an intuitive mother will say, you know, Savta's coming, and I'm looking out the window, and her car is going to go from over there. Is that information that the baby needs? No. What does the baby need? I'm looking out the window. I am waiting for Savta. I'm sharing with you who I am. Now, that sharing is the subject. But whose subject is it? It turns out that that's the first subject for the baby. Our first subject is the other. The other who shares their subject with us. That's what makes it possible for the baby to say, next time I look out the window, I'm going to bring you over and show you what I've been looking at. I'm going to be able to share what's going on inside of me. That's what's called intersubjectivity. And, yeah, Maria?
Sorry, I thought that the first other would be the child's recognition that the mother is separate from the self. So the mother would be the object, not what the mother's looking at.
Maria just asked the question, which everybody asked Dan Stern when he made this proposition. He said, it's verkehrt. What are you talking about? But Stern's position, based on...
Like Buber.
What's that?
Buber would say...
Sorry?
Buber. Martin Buber would say, no, the other would be the mother.
We will get to Martin Buber in detail after in lesson number 4. We're going to actually read Martin Buber and see what he says. So Maria's absolutely right that, wait a minute, as a matter of fact, when Stern wrote this, I wrote to him and said, you know, Buber? And his answer was, well, that's interesting. My daughter was telling me that too. Maybe I'll look into it. So there's some Buber there, but we want to build it, and then Buber comes in a little later. It's easier to appreciate. But so the idea was that the first self is the other. If we're talking the language of self, the notion up until Stern was that the baby has a self, and then it's not paying attention to others, and it becomes open to others. But if you look at the interaction between babies and mothers, and that's what Stern did for about 40 years, and I put up on the lesson an article about Stern, a lovely article of one of his colleagues that will give you some, it's extra reading that I'll put up every now and then for those who are interested to see what on earth was going on there for 40 years. He said, wait a minute, the baby doesn't yet have a full sense of self. The sense of self grows. The regulating self, the core self, needs a other self-object who regulates it. The intersubjective self builds subjectivity. You're not born with subjectivity. You're born with a sense of self that grows. The sense of self is like a developmental line. That's a term that Barbara's going to teach you about in detail in the next class. It's like one of the developmental lines is, how do you get the self? Well, you don't just get it like that. It turns out you build a sense of self. The sense of subjectivity you build from somebody else's subjectivity by the sharing of the subjectivity. So when we say intersubjectivity, it doesn't mean, pay attention now, because this is where it goes for carrot, that's why Maria jumped. It doesn't mean the baby now has the subject that it shares with mother. It is for carrot. The mother starts to share her subjectivity with the baby, and that helps the baby to build its own subjectivity. That has not been easy for anybody to accept from 1985 on, but it's how it looks if you look carefully. If you look carefully in the laboratory, if you look at children carefully, you see that the sense of subjectivity is built together with the other. It's not that I have it and then someone understands me. Now, this sounds a little different, huh? Because, you know, we're used to saying, this would be the next level. Instead of saying, I'm coming home upset and I need to be soothed, I'm coming home upset, I need to be understood. I need to be understood. No one understands me. I need to be understood. Well, it turns out that that's not how intersubjectivity works. That intersubjectivity works if you come home and you need your wife to pay attention to you. You would want to separate between, I need to be soothed, do something so that I can get to a state of being soothed, or share yourself with me. Listen to me in a way that I feel your presence, your subjectivity. If you listen in a way that I feel that I'm listening to by somebody, not by a hand who's stroking me, but by somebody who's bringing herself to understand what I'm talking about, that's what intersubjectivity is about. Now, that's a developmental stage, and let me just show you a way of looking at it. Can you see that at all? Yeah, Shiva.
Question. When a child, who let's say is 2 years old, and they can already...
A little louder.
Let's say a child who's 2 years old,
yeah.
and they already see the mother as themselves, so to speak, like,
yeah.
So that's how they start learning. But let's say the mother's not around, let's say it's a babysitter. Does this theory only work with primary caregivers, or is this with anyone?
The question is, are we talking about mother or about other human beings? There is no theory that works only on the primary caregiver. There are lots of theories that were discovered with primary caregivers. The human baby never had a primary caregiver until the 20th century. It's a creation of nuclear families. Before that, it was much more spread out. If you look in many cultures, and my guess is if you look in well-connected Haredi families, you'll find that this primary caregiver is a little bit exaggerated. It's a cultural creation of capitalism that separates people from their land, from their origins, and makes them run around trying to make a living and scatters them, right? America, right? So that's sort of an exaggerated answer to your question, but every theory about people is about people. It's studied about the baby's experience because that's how they live, but that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. So let's assume it's about what people do together. It doesn't look like we're going to get too far with these slides. Those of you who happen to be in Paris someday, there's a small museum which is part of the Louvre, but it's outside. It's a different neighborhood called the Musée de Cluny. It used to be a monastery. And there's a room there with these tapestries that I'm showing you. It's a set of 6 tapestries that were done in Belgium or in the 1400s, and the one that I want to show you, which I hope you'll be able to see, is supposedly about this different sensations. So there's a slide for each sensation. You can see them in your reader, I think, better than you can see that here. We will solve the question of light at some point too. It's not solved yet. But here's the important one. This is, you know, I was at this museum looking at this tapestry. We'll go back one.
They have them in cloisters in Washington.
I'm sorry?
They have them in cloisters in Washington Heights. They're very similar.
I can't hear you.
Sorry.
What?
They have similar sets of tapestries in the cloisters in Washington Heights.
Right.
Very similar.
Right. Somebody has from Breuer's, huh? There's a similar set of unicorn tapestries in Washington Heights, way up in Fort Tryon Park, in the Cloisters Museum. Those are also brought in from Europe. This, if you look at the one that's supposed to be about vision, there were ones about taste and smell and hearing. This one is about vision. And if you look closely, it's about, you know, a woman and the unicorn. Do you know where the source of the unicorn is? Who made up a unicorn? Why do we have unicorns? Turns out the reason we have unicorn is the Latin translation for Re'em, to Afot Re'em. Re'em in the ancient Near East was the largest, very impressive wild animal. It was a wild ox, the Re'em. But then the Bible was being translated into Greek in Africa, in Alexandria, and they didn't know what a re'em was because it's a different climate. So the most impressive animal that has this power that they could find was a rhinoceros. And the rhinoceros in Greek is called monokeratos, mono one, keratos horn, because it's instead of two horns, one set of horns, with one singular horns. So the re'em showed up in the Bible as in Greek as a monokeratos. That's in Africa. That goes up to Europe, where they don't know the Greek, and they've never seen a rhinoceros. So what did they do? They just translated from mono to uni, and keratos corn. You get a unicorn. So they just translated it, but they didn't know what it was. So it became a, you know. So anyway, the source of this unicorn is the re'em. But in Europe, it has a different set of meanings. And if you look carefully here, there's a mirror, and there's this grand lady, and there's a unicorn. So naturally, you would expect the woman to be looking in the mirror, right? If you look a little closer, you'll see that she's not looking in the mirror. She's showing the mirror to the unicorn. But she's showing with a bit of change in perspective. And they don't have this one in Washington Heights. There's no mirror there. And the background is more blue and green. You've been there a few times, huh? It's a great Travis afternoon. So I used to live in the Heights. So what is the mother showing? She's showing the unicorn a mirror. What is in the mirror? What her eyes see, with a bit of change in perspective. You see, if I hold the mirror here to you, then I am showing you in the mirror what I see. I'm showing you the you that I see, because the mirror is aligned with my eyes. And so eyes both see and show. As you know, from the difference in the nusach of Ashkenaz and Teiman, chayav adam lirot et atzmo, chayav adam leharot et atzmo, right? In the Seder, right? What is chayav adam leharot et atzmo? You have to show yourself as if you're going out. You have to do a drama. It's not that you see it; you have to show it. So the eyes both see and show. And if you look at this picture, you say, well, here it is. This is intersubjective function. I am showing you what I see. The you that I'm reacting to is the you that I see. It's not an objective you that needs to get attention by taking the ball. It's you that's said by I. Uber. Here we go. It's the you that's said by I. You can't say the you without the I. Right? So this I is a subjective I that creates intersubjective experience. And that's what happens in the second year of life. That we go, the intersubjective. Now, the way to do that is a beautiful set of experiments that were done with, how do we know this? Maybe, for example, let's say a baby makes a movement. The baby does a movement like this. A baby's moving, 2 years old, like that. Now, if the mother would just imitate that, right? So you would say, well, the baby sees something like itself, but it doesn't know that it's been through somebody else, because it's just an imitation. It looks the same. But if, when the baby does this, mother says, ah, but that's the music to the dance. In other words, that the intensity of the ah is like the intensity of the movement. Like this would be, there'll be ah, and it was, there'll be ah, right? Ah. So you're creating the music for the dance, the same intensity, the same time, the same rhythm, the same pace, the same duration, and the same spatial orientation. What we find is that in the second year of life, when you imitate a baby, it interests the baby much less. When you do something that involves what's called affective attunement, you go through another sensory system. If the baby is making noise, you do the dance. If the baby is doing a dance, you make the noise, and so forth. That's what makes babies interested. Now, if you think about it, how is it that the baby knows that this is the music to its dance? How does it know that? I'll get to that in a second. But the fact that it knows it, The fact that it knows it means that this has been through another person. Your presence is not in imitating. Your presence is in doing something that's attuned. I'm creating the music to the dance, but who's there creating the music? Somebody's there, right? I've had a subjective experience that I'm sharing with you. There's an I there who's responding to you. Now, how exactly does a baby know that fits exactly with the movement? That's something just worth knowing about. That the different sensations that we have are not separated at birth. There's all sorts of legends about what happens, at birth, but one of the things that does not happen at birth is that babies separate different experiences. I'll give you an extreme example. If you take a nipple, let's say that has a triangle on it. Now, why would you do that? Only a man would do an experiment like that. But let's say that somebody did it. Put a nipple with a triangle, and the baby's sucking the triangle. And then you show the baby a triangle, he recognizes the triangle, and vice versa. So here it is, the feeling in your mouth and what you see are one. All the sensations are at first not separated. That's what makes opera interesting, right? That you take all the sensations and put them together. And this is what's called a synesthetic experience for older people, because you take different aesthetics, different sensations, and you bring them together. It creates a sense of integration. Babies are born, in other words, we're born with an integration, and we gradually separate it, and at better artistic moments, they come together, because they meant to come together. That's how they were once. So the baby can recognize, as connected to its dance, and feels somebody's there with a subjectivity that they're sharing with me. And they're not just regulating or copying me, they're present themselves. Now, this we can call, in English, we can call it intersubjective. It's not so terrible a word. In Hebrew, it's awful, so I call it the realm of the I. But intersubjective is not so bad. Intersubjectivity has to do with differences. The mother is present as an I if she's different. She's using a different sensation. She's doing something that interests the baby. It has to do with curiosity. You pay attention now. When I was putting my finger out and making the baby pay attention to the ball, we're talking about not differences, we're talking about sameness. I want the baby to do what I want the baby to do, and the baby wants to do what I want it to do, because that's what the baby needs from me. So we're the same. Intersubjectivity begins with differences. You can't be the same and be yourself. It has to do with curiosity. That's what happens when the baby climbs on the counter. The baby says, "Who are you? And what are you doing?" But the first question is, who are you? Are you you? And we can use a term called co-creation. This is a term that was created by Stern in 2004. You could also call it mutual creation. You see, when the baby is looking out and the mother is saying, "I am waiting, I am thinking, I am looking," so a moment is created that wasn't there before. It wasn't there for mother, because now she's sharing it with the other one. It wasn't there for the baby, because something's being shared. And so intersubjectivity are moments of mutual presence, and it's something that you don't come to the moment with. You come to the moment with the capacity to create that moment, but the creation of the moment is something that happens mutually between two subjects who are both present and communicating together. Now, I just want to finish one last slide, and then we'll have time for maybe a question or two, and we'll do an exercise about it. This is, you're not going to see too many slides like this. It looks scientific. This is what's called a complemental series. One Jewish scientist found complemental series very appealing as a way of thinking about ourselves, and that was Freud. But this is a different one. You see, what happens is when you start life, or when you start any relationship, you begin with the need for regulation. You begin with a question of how you regulate each other, and then as the relationship grows, or as the people grow, then you move to the possibility for intersubjective. First year, second year, roughly speaking, it's actually about 9 months, and then until about the age of 2. So babies and mothers grow, and so when you say, well, wait a minute, what if I said to the baby, get off this counter and play with the ball? Didn't I tell you to play with the ball? Haven't you been listening for 2 years? You always play with the ball. Play with the ball. Well, that would be fine if the baby were a year younger. But it's not fine now because the baby has grown to the point of needing something different, right? And to your question of, if you give what's needed or you give what you want to give, if the mother is so successful with regulating, she doesn't want to stop regulating, she's going to have trouble switching gears because the baby now needs something different. And this will happen in relationships as well. Every relationship, marriage relationship, somebody wrote a question about what about the Haredi men and women? The women get married pretty young. So maybe the regulatory function is a big part of the marriage at the beginning. And then you could say, well, if it's a big part of the marriage at the beginning, can it grow to the intersubjective? Do people get used to regulating each other in order not to listen to each other? Or do they regulate in order to get confident enough in the regulation in order to be able to move to the intersubjective? That will happen with clients as well. Clients sometimes come in with a need for regulation. They're in crisis, and what do you need to do? Talk about the meaning of the crisis? Not yet. Not yet, because they're not there yet. They need to find some regulation. You need to sit down. With children, you give them some cookies. With adults, you give them some water, and you ask, some questions about who they are. You make contact with them. You start to dance a little bit with them. You do something that makes something that's regulated in the room. But when the room is regulated, then you have to grow, right? Then you have to go, and that may be 6 months into the treatment. You have to move from, okay, now we're quiet, let's look for trouble. Now let's try to understand what it means between people. So one danger of this chart is that if you start with regulation, you don't want to let go of it. So the therapy becomes a bit addicting, or the couple become a bit addicted to each other, but they don't have intersubjective communication. So the ability to move from regulation to intersubjective is crucial. And the other thing that, the other mistake comes from the other side, that if you see people who need regulation and you start draining them a cup about intersubjectivity, was it need, your associations, right? Freud thought that psychoanalysis was appropriate for 5% of the population, because he knew he was draining a cup, and he knew that a lot of people, can't lie down and that's just not going to work. He said, I'm doing research, I'm going to learn something from this. It's not the way to treat everybody. So sometimes because the therapist, back to your question of what the therapist needs, the therapist wants to find meaning. Put it this way, therapists are a bit addicted to intersubjectivity. We love intersubjectivity. Nobody goes into becoming a therapist in order to regulate people. You can do something else. Therapy means intersubjectivity. That's what happens. But not every client is there yet. And sometimes the therapist has to learn how to live with the regulating self-object function until you can grow to the point of intersubjectivity. One question and then we'll go on. Yeah.
How do you know that how did that concern know that the young child just needs to be regulated with the hand? Maybe he couldn't get up on the counter.
The 7-month-old?
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you try doing affect attunement before you have the intersubjective function, the baby's more interested in an exact copy. The baby's more interested in what regulates them than what challenges them. The babies get to be more interested. It's something you can measure in the laboratory. Is that a proof? Yeshiva Shalmata. It's not a proof, but it's useful to think of it that way. It helps us with our kids. What's that?
It sounds superficial, like just copying the baby is what a younger baby needs, and hopefully later on he needs to.
Right. So Moshe's question is, wait a minute, that's too superficial. But if you look at the chart, that's why we have the complemental series. It is not true that there's a stage of regulation and then there's a stage of intersubjective. That's not true. That's not how life is. That's not how development is. What's true is that what goes on between a mother and a baby at the beginning is more regulation and less intersubjective, and they switch at some point. In other words, as the regulation becomes more secure, more recognized, more practiced, then you grow, and there's some internal development as well. You reach a point where you're doing more intersubjective and less regulation.
But it sounds like that the regulation, let's say the way you describe it in couple therapy, is something that when he's in crisis, regulation has a function.
Oh.
Right? So that means that the young child is in crisis. So
no, young child's always in crisis. That's what young children are. Right? They're crisionerim. They, something spills and they're screaming. They're always at the edge of crisis. Crisis means they don't have the ego tools to manage what's coming at them from the outside world. The couple who will come that way, you quiet them down, you help them to regulate each other, and then you have to say, are we ready to do intersubjective work? If you don't, because otherwise the couple will leave you. They'll say, well, thank you very much. We're much more quiet now until the next crisis. Gesundheit. And that's where the intersubjective is a real challenge. So what I'm going to suggest we do now is do the groups. Some of the questions that you have will become more intersubjective as we do the groups. And then when we come back, we'll spend 20 minutes talking about what we've learned from the groups. Okay? And over there. We had 2 small groups this time. Is that right? Did that work out better?
Yeah.
So let's hear what people want to share about what we're in the middle of learning now. And then that will continue in the blog, where we will see everybody in the blog. Okay, what do you folks want to say to each other? Yes?
I had a question more.
Questions, okay.
The picture, like, you were saying that the woman was showing the unicorn, what she's seeing. And in the picture more like she's showing the unicorn what he is, like how he looks like.
I used the picture. There was another question exactly like that. I use the picture. There's a problem of perspective. The mother's not holding the mirror here. She's holding it here, right? She's
not looking at the mirror. She's just showing.
But she's showing, if you sort of are flexible with the perspective in the picture, then what I'm trying to use it for is that she's showing the unicorn how I see you. This is how you look in my eyes. It's more like that than anything else, and she's certainly not looking in the mirror.
This is how the unicorn can see itself.
Right. There's 500 years separating this picture from Kohat, so it's not a picture painted to explain Kohat. It's an import, and like all imports, it works. Either it works or it doesn't, but it's not exact. Okay. What else? What did you folks learn by talking to each other? I know that you're dying to put it in the blog, but some of it, yeah.
Our group discussed the importance of knowing what you need to regulate yourself. As in if you need some personal space, or if you need to talk to someone, like just knowing what you need. But many times that's impossible because their kids are around and crying, you can't just do that thing you need to do. So we discussed that it's also very important to know how to put it off. Like to accept the situation that you're in, accept that you're in distress, and then know how to deal with it.
Okay, so the comment is that it's terribly important and absolutely impossible. That will happen all the time. That's what human relationships are about. Something that's awfully important, completely impossible. It's awfully important to be able to say, this is what I need. But when I'm upset, that's completely impossible. That's a fantasy. So how do you find out what you need? You work on it, you go back and forth, and you figure out at the end what it was. If you look back at it, you say, oh, that's what I needed. But it never works that way at the beginning. People don't turn deeply to each other and say, I need a little affective regulation, I need a little intersubjective. That isn't how people talk. That's how we think, but that's also not how we talk in therapy. We talk the way everybody talks, which is you're upset and we use ourselves. Yeah?
We also discussed the fine line of regulation and support and how to use your support and like where you start, like the healthy place to start and how you use it.
Right, okay, so Yudis is added in the word support, which is a very, very important word in mental health. It's, one of the dividing lines between therapy that's supportive and therapy that is exploratory, but it's a false divide. Just same as you saw in the complemental series. There are elements of support in exploratory therapy. There are elements of exploration in supportive therapy. The danger is to get addicted to supportive therapy. In other words, to see it as only regulation and not go beyond it to try to understand intersubjectively. Now, what I just did is that's what people do in magic tricks, so don't accept it at face value. We have two separate lines of thinking. One line of thinking is about the regulation and intersubjective, and the other is about support and exploratory. They're not the same concepts. They come from different ways of thinking. So I just, put them together to try to see how they interact, but they're not exactly the same. And, as we become better as a group, someone will say, "You're doing that again." Support doesn't mean regulation. Support is a different value. It has something different to say than the word regulation. I just put them together to try to help you with the question for now. But I want you guys to be on guard. You have to be careful with me, because I'm going to say things that aren't exact. And that's your job to say, "What?" That's a good way to say, "What?" And then I hear "what?" and I do a dance. Right? And then well.
How do you understand support with self-regulation versus place?
Right, so you want an answer. And I don't have the answer right now. I'm satisfied with the question, because I need to think too. But it's a good question for the blog. Yudis. So then maybe we'll hear some thoughts about support and, Maria.
So I don't know if this is an answer, but in our group we were talking about, Caleb and Flashman, maybe we need self-regulation first, regulatory therapy first to be held in a safe space. And then once you're regulated, then you're able to move into the intersubjective work, which is the exploratory and co-creation of...
Right. So Maria has just recreated the party line. In other words, that's exactly what I'm trying to say, but it is not the world. It's some way of saying it. And so you'll see, if you recall, we'll stop with this because we want to give time for a break. If you recall, Mr. A, I told you about Kohat's Mr. A, the man that made him discover intersubjective, the self-object function, that Mr. A was getting upset, and Kohat was saying to him, "You're resisting. You need more intersubjective. You need to understand what's going on." And Mr. A said, "I need you to regulate me. I can't, you're driving me crazy by telling me that I need to think more deeply. I'm not there now. I need you," right? And so Kohat, at that wonderful moment that changed psychoanalysis forever, said, "Oh, good God, you're not resisting me. This is what you need right now. And I get it, and I'm sorry that I wasn't giving it." And that didn't end the analysis. It made the analysis possible. So, the chart of the complemental series is about a to and fro that you say about your patients. It's not a bad thing if you come in upset about the fact that the Rebbe said he's going to throw your kid out of Cheder, and so you're upset about it. That's not resisting couples therapy. It's something that needs attention in a different way, and then we'll get back to understanding why you created a kid who the Rebbe can't stand. One last question.
If I understand what you're saying right, then you're basically saying that the question is the wrong question, because it's not who helps me understand myself when I'm upset. It's like understanding and being upset needs to be separated. So first I need to calm down from being upset, and then I can understand myself. Like you need someone to regulate and be there for you, to be not upset, like to just deal with the upsetness, and then once you calm down a little, you work on it.
So one way of looking at it, right? We're always talking about one way of looking at it, because every time you're with a different client, you're going to find a different way of looking at it, right? So we don't want to say the way of looking at it, but one way to begin is to say, they're upset, they need something different from me. And when we go through that part of it, it was on the chart, it was the left side of the chart, we can do the regulation and then move back on to intersubjective. But if we try to do intersubjective
on the right side, when really on the left side, it's not going to work, and it's going to actually make the intersubjective worse rather than better, because it's not falling on the people who can deal with it. And now I hope you are confused enough to have enormous motivation to talk with each other on the blog, and we'll continue next week. Thank you.